Hello, everyone. I'm Vicki Healy at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and welcome to today's webinar, which is co-hosted by the Clean Energy Solutions Center and ISNAD-Africa. Today's topic is sustainable energy, and the 2030 agenda is Africa on track. A few things to know before we begin. I'd like to go over some features. So for audio, you have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over your telephone. And if you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option that's in the audio box. And if you would like to dial in by telephone, select the telephone option, and a box on the right side of your screen will display the telephone number along with an audio pin that you will use to activate your audio features. And just again, a gentle reminder to our panelists to please mute your audio when you are not presenting. To illustrate the features that I just talked about a little bit and go into a bit more detail and give you a clearer picture, we've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. So you should see something that looks like this in the upper right corner of your screen. You can submit text questions to the presenters by typing your questions into the questions panel. So you can send your questions in at any time. Dami will collect those and we will respond to them during the question and answer session. Also, it's a good idea when you submit your question, if you would please include the name of the presenter you are addressing your question to so that we make sure we're directing it to the right person. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. First up, we have Mr. Adedoyin Adeleke, founder and executive director of the International Support Network for African Development, also known as ISNAD-Africa. Adedoyin is a PhD candidate with the UNESCO Chair in Energy for Sustainable Development at the Polytech Nicodi in Milano, Italy. And Mr. Adeleke today, he is going to be telling us a little bit about the program, give us an overview, as well as some introductory remarks. And then following Adedoyin, we have the good fortune today to have Ms. Yunshu Lee, a professional from the International Energy Agency, also known as IRENA. Yunshi is part of the long-term energy planning team, and her work involves the analysis of long-term energy systems with a focus on Africa's power systems. In this webinar, Ms. Lee will present the key findings of IRENA's work on Africa's power system conducted using the System Planning Test, also known as SPLAT, and she will discuss the current status of the continent's electricity generations, its aspirations, and the challenges and rewards of using renewable energy to power Africa's electricity needs. So with those quick introductions in place, I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Adedoyin for his introductory remarks and an overview of the program. So Adedoyin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see it perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. And my name is Adedoyin Adeleke. I work for ISNAD-Africa as Executive Director, and want to appreciate you for joining the program and for your interest in the mentoring for research program itself, and also for joining the webinar. Let me also appreciate our speaker, Yunshu Lee from IRENA, and also the hosts, Clean Energy Solutions Center. I'll be doing very shortly the corporate presentation of ISNAD-Africa. ISNAD-Africa is the International Support Network for African Development, and we're committed to raising global multi-stakeholder support for clean energy transition in Africa. And once I'm done with that, I'll talk about the program itself and some of the impacts we've been able to make within the few years we've been running the program. Okay, basically we're committed to supporting North-South and South-South collaboration for partnership and knowledge transfer for green growth in Africa. We're also committed to building human capacity by raising new generation of sustainable energy, environment and climate experts in Africa. We also look forward to increasing environmental literacy among various people groups on the continent. We're committed to stimulating and promoting innovations and networking for green growth, and also to bridge the gap between education, research, policy, and practice in sustainable energy, environment, and climate change. You see, then there are some of our partners, which I'm going to show later on. And before I forget, we operate as a network, a global network with various stakeholders, up to about 1,120 members from 72 countries. These are our stakeholders, and I highlight where you see we have an internal structure, board of trustee, partnership, our partners, and you see that the support of the Clean Energy Solution Center, and also where the mentees that are coming in fall within they are a major stakeholder in our program and our structure, and of course the regulators. And still coming from later this year, we'll be engaging with policymakers beyond just the student. And here are some of our partners that we're partnered with and the global network where we belong. And the latest, just to mention, is our partnership. ISNAD-Africa has been selected as one of the 5 partners of the WWF, that's the Worldwide Fund for Nature, for its African Youth Transformational Leadership Program. And also we've got a partnership and support from the North American Association for Environmental Education. So now, straight to the program. I love to say this everywhere I can, that Africa is too rich to be poor. Many thanks to the international community for various support for Africa. But I like to emphasize again that Africa is too rich to be poor. Why? Because we have a lot of resources, as you see in the map. We have a lot of resources, but the energy we need to transform the resources to wealth has been the challenge. The limited energy generation, as you would know, Africa is about 16% of the global population, but we only account for 3% to 4% of energy consumption. But why? We have the resources for energy, we have the resources for the natural resources that we can transform to wealth. So the problem has been, simply the capacity. We have challenges in various dimensions. We have business model, challenges on business model, challenges of innovation and things like that. But when you look at the thin line that connects all these challenges, all these limitations, is capacity. When we're talking about business model, is human capacity that we need to develop this. When you talk about teaching and research, it is simply about human capacity. So Sub-Saharan Africa is currently the most electricity poor region in the world. Now, unlike Europe and America, where you have universities that have developed courses for renewable energy, for instance, environment and climate change programs, dedicated programs. Most of the African universities sharing our countries are yet to upgrade our curriculum to that extent. And you see this from the IRENA report for 2019. Africa accounts for less than 3% of about 11 million renewable energy jobs. It's not a matter of the resources. We have huge resources. Solar, for instance, is abundant all over Africa, but simply about the human capacity. When we identify this problem, we have to assess whether we should sit, wait, or act. And we decided to act. And we came up with this strategy, with this program, as a knowledge transfer and capacity development mechanism that look around the world and look for experts across the world. The challenge is experts. Okay, let's look around for experts across the world and find students in African universities, even though there are no courses. We don't have enough courses, so to say, in our university systems that have dedicated programs for these topics. We have students, for instance, in law. We have students in journalism. We have students in accounting. We have students in electrical engineering that wants to do their research on a specific dimension of these issues. And then we try to, when we find such students, we link them up with experts across the world and at no cost to them. So we try with that. We don't look for mentors around the world that are just from the academia. We also look for mentors from industry, from think tanks across the world, including people from government as well. So that helps us to support industry-related and practice-oriented research. And beyond this, our intention is that annually, we'll be able to support the mentees, the students that will pick up for the program, that will select for the program, We support them to do an outreach, to also extend the knowledge they are getting to various people, groups of their interest. This will be self-proposed, but who we support. And we hope that annually we'll also be able to bring the students together to share, because one of the challenges we have is that apart from generating knowledge, there is a gap, which I identified in our major objective. There is a gap between academia and the industry, and academia and the government. We're doing a lot of research, but how are they feeding into the industry? How are they feeding into policy with government? So we intend that annually we'll be able to gather the students and look at specifically what the outcome of their research is, and look at who is it, which stakeholder will be interested in listening to this. We'll bring them together to discuss the outcome of their research, and with that, we'll be impacting industry and policy, as you will see. However, these two parts, the outreach and the symposium, we have not been able to do it. We have only limited the scope up to now to the mentoring program, but we are seeking support with international organizations to support us to scale up the program. Okay, and the global response has been very impressive. In just 2 years, this is the third cohort of the program. In just 2 years, we've seen that people from about 178 countries have visited the website thus far. Every day we have visitors from 15 to 20 countries, and that's really impressed us. And if you look at the number of, you see, the website has been visited over 90,000 times by over 42,000 people. That the number of visitors is, the number of times is more than ×2 of the number of visitors. So it shows that every single person that visited with the website came back again. So it shows that there is interest from the global community. And to emphasize this again, we started reaching out to mentors across the world, despite the busy schedule, despite that we don't pay them. We currently have about 130 mentors, many of them very senior experts from international organizations like Harvard University, University College London, IPCC, WWF, even World Bank. We have 150 mentors from over 50 countries. You can see their profile on the website. Currently, we have been able to support about 57 students, masters and PhD, in 38 universities in 13 African countries. We're still hoping to be able to support more. This does not include the third cohort of the program, which are currently coming in. So just to mention about the impact of the program, this was the people you are seeing on the screen, some of the mentors at the University of Waterloo that we met at the innovation lab in Waterloo last year. Yeah, beyond that, beyond the mentoring support, we also collaborate with international organizations to see how they can support the program, to also increase the offerings of the program. And we got a partnership with CIPSEM. CIPSEM is the Center for Center for Postgraduate Studies of Environmental Management, CIPSEM in Germany. And through the program, they're able to support the most outstanding and best performing mentees of the program. So we are currently selecting, this was 2018, I think 2018, middle of 2018 that they were in Germany. And currently we're selecting for those that will be going for this year. So the selection is based on, yes, the student profile, and much importantly, their performance in the mentoring program, among other factors. And this is a testimonial from, actually we've had a couple of students that graduated, and you can see the testimonial on the website, but this is the first PhD graduate. And it says that mentoring for research program break racial and continental barriers. The story is very interesting, and he just completed his master's PhD research. So we organized, in collaboration with Clean Energy Solutions Center, we've organized a number of webinars, which you can find on our YouTube channel. Yeah, beyond this, I'm going to skip this because of time, but we also, like you see in the objective, we also try to educate students, secondary school students beyond the university students, on environmental education in general. And this was a very impressive workshop we had on ground in Cameroon. This was in Yaoundé last year in Cameroon. I'm going to skip that. We also organized webinars like this for them. This was Nigeria and South Africa. And these are some of the testimonials we have from them. This was Cameroon and Uganda. These are testimonials from them. And beyond this, this year we have a support from the North American Association for Environmental Education. We'll be extending this to at least 3 other countries in 2020. We hope that COVID stops in time. Yeah, so Talking about the impact of the mentoring program, one of the things we want to see is we're not just interested in doing research, but how can we use this research to impact the policymakers, the industry experts, and even the think tanks in academia. And we are very happy that we've been able to present this at the Italian National Conference on Development and Cooperation. This was in attendance of the program was the Prime Minister of Italy, and President of Central African Republic, a couple of EU commissioners and ministers of Italian governments, CEO of multinational organizations. So, and beyond that, the policymakers, like I showed earlier, when University of Waterloo, where we had experts from the industry and academia that were able to interact together, and we fed into the discussion there. The same thing at UNESCO Chair in Technologies for Development in Switzerland. We also had a conference there with the academia, basically. But we make effort to influence the media as well, and we're going to intensify efforts on this. So I'm showing this because we're not just interested in the research. We focus on how we can use the research to impact the system, the industry and the government. Beyond this, we also take advantage of social media to do a couple of tweet chats. We've hosted the head of the regional director for Africa of WWF, also the director of CIPSA. And we're very grateful for these wonderful young people in 10 countries across 5 continents of the world, who many of them have never met themselves, yet they are doing an amazing job together. We appreciate them for their support, and this is the support team, but I think the graphic designer managed to skip me out of this, but I'm somewhere there. Okay. Yeah, and we're grateful for our advisory board from different parts of the world that are supporting the program and advising us. ISNAD-Africa is a youth-led organization, but we rely so much on the experience of our advisors. We say that Africa is too rich to be poor, we choose to act. Thank you.
Thank you, Adedoyin, and now we're switching over to Yunshu Lee to make her presentation.
Hi, thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Adedoyin, for your presentation. That was very impressive, and I'm very inspired by this initiative. It's the first time that I've heard about it, but we will certainly be interested in collaborating as well if you want to consider IRENA as a partner. So yes, my name is Yunshu, and I come from the International Renewable Energy Agency. It's a pleasure to an honor to be invited to speak for this webinar. So my presentation will mainly cover the energy sector, mainly the electricity part of the energy sector. And I certainly agree with what was mentioned, that Africa is too rich to be poor. So this piece of work that we are currently doing is actually not just from me, but from a number of colleagues in the team. And I just want to acknowledge them as well for their efforts. So as a start, I would like to give a short introduction on IRENA's expertise and programs on long-term planning. So IRENA, we are an international organization. As all international organizations are, we are answerable to our member countries. So we have about 180 member countries, and our work program, or what we do in the next 2 years or the next year, will be determined by discussing with these countries what their actual needs are. And one of our aims, well, actually our main aim, is to promote renewable energy, as it's very obvious from the name that we are the International Renewable Energy Agency. And this includes bioenergy, geothermal energy, hydropower, wind power, and also we have been looking at technology innovations like batteries, hydrogen storage, etc. And we work closely in collaboration with industry as well as academia. We also invite experts to come to our events to share with us their expertise and knowledge in the field. So we have our headquarters in Abu Dhabi. I am in the Bonn office, which is the Innovation and Technology Center. So our Abu Dhabi colleagues are the direct interface between us and the member countries. And at the Innovation and Technology Center, we do more technical analysis on these types of technologies. Yeah. So moving on, our activities for supporting planning of variable renewables in Africa is pretty systematic. We get the data from our teams in Abu Dhabi, from our Atlas teams, from our cost teams at the IITC. And with this set of data, we put together an analysis using a least cost investment planning tool. And that is a SPLAT model, which I will touch upon later. We also look at grid stability, and we focus a lot on the power sector, but we also look at how renewable energy is key to reaching other types of goals, other goals which have to do with empowerment, female empowerment, women empowerment, poverty alleviation, etc. And with our analysis, we then feed it into concrete actions, like we use our analysis to influence governments to so that they factor in more renewables in their master plans. We also derive projects which can be implemented from our analysis. We also provide certain funding options, and yeah, it's basically a whole package that we do to support the planning of renewables in Africa. Yes, and moving on. So today's theme is really, are we on track? And to answer that question, we have to first define a track. So that is what my team's work is focused on. We help governments plan their energy systems better. And right now, as you know, at the end of this year, countries are supposed to submit their NDCs again, and that is a kind of track setting. So the track setting is a continuously ongoing process, and we are part of that process. So what the track, when we set a target, what we need to show is not just a target for 2030. We also need to understand first what is possible and what are the caveats for reaching these targets. For instance, what is the investment cost that we have to put in order to reach this target? And what are the actual goals, the bigger picture? Because to say that we want to achieve 50% of VRE by 2030 doesn't really mean anything if we don't also consider the amount of energy access that African nationals, African people living on the continent will be achieving by 2030. So when we talk about long-term planning, we need to think about these things collectively as a whole. And that is what a lot of the energy planners are coming together to do. So this slide basically highlights what are the benefits of setting good goals or long-term energy planning. So not only is it beneficial as an end to have an end product that is a set of goals, but the process itself also creates consensus among stakeholders. So the process of setting these goals are also very valuable. Yeah. Yeah, so at IRENA, we do we do capacity building with African countries. As Adedoyin highlighted, a key thing which is currently lacking is probably capacity, and capacity not only in terms of the academic expertise, but also the knowledge of the industries and also of the knowledge of the energy planners. So one of IRENA's activities is to build this capacity of energy planning within the government, within the energy planners, within policymakers. And we have over the last years, we actually have achieved quite a lot with that. So one of the most recent achievement is in 2018, where we supported Eswatini in coming up with a master plan for their energy systems to 2034. That is the most recent, but before that, we have also done a lot of work with West Africa, and we have done both regional work as well as country level, national type of work. So we work a lot with our partners in these countries, and we hope to, well, basically bring the best practice of energy planning to governments and industry. So accompanying these activities on the ground, we also do analysis, which is using the SPLAT model that I mentioned earlier. So these are types of analysis that highlights where is the potential for renewable energy deployment, and what is the kind of investment that countries' governments will have to put in order to achieve that type of renewable energy levels. So we do this with the SPLAT model, which is built using IAEA's message framework. So IAEA is actually the International Atomic Energy Agency. As the name suggests, they mainly focus on atomic energy, but then they also do similar work in terms of capacity building using their message model. So we have adopted that, and we have changed that in a way that is also good in representing renewables. We have done that for all the 5 power pools in Africa, and we are continuously updating these power pool reports. So that is basically a short introduction on what IRENA and my team does. So maybe next up, I'll highlight what is the current status and also the recent developments of Africa's power systems. So yes, so Africa, as we all know, it is developing. And it is very diverse. We can't talk about Africa as if it's just one continent. It's actually separate. It is actually very diverse from the north to the south and the east to the west. The economic levels are diverse. The resource distribution is diverse. But today I will try to talk about it a bit more as a continent. So what we see is that the power consumption has gone up over the last 25 years, and it has gone up by a lot. So this is demonstrative of the economic development that is ongoing on the continent. For instance, in Eastern and Southern Africa, power consumption has doubled over 25 years between 1991 and 2016. And at the same time, there is a lot of opportunity for renewable energy. So renewables capacity doubled in 10 years. So that is a very high achievement. And although you might not be able to see solar so clearly on this graph because it is still relatively small, but if I may point out, it has doubled in 2 years. So that is a very quick, very fast pace of increase. And it is commendable. However, at the moment, more can still be done because right now 80% of the power on the continent is still generated from combustible fuels, and it is increasing at the same rate with demand. So it's increasing at 2% per annum approximately. And the reason why renewable energy has been deployed so much over the last years, one key reason is that the global levelized cost of electricity has significantly reduced in the recent years. So the levelized cost of electricity is basically the amount of, the electricity cost that you have to pay in order for you to make even your investment. So if the cost drops, that means you pay less and less. And so what we see on these graphs are that for solar PV, over the last 10 years, it has almost dropped by 90%. And for wind technologies, so for Africa, the wind technology that we focus on is onshore wind. It has also dropped by 30%. So that's quite a lot. And we project to see it drop continuously for the next few years. So where do we stand now in terms of electricity generation and access to electricity? So in 2017, it is still not very high. Only 45% of the population had access to electricity, and the power consumption was also approximately 490 kilowatt hour per capita. So this can definitely be increased, and it is the goal of many governments on the continent, many countries, that they are going to increase this energy access rate for the next over the next years. And because of these targets, we do think that demand on the continent is certainly going to increase, and it is going to increase by a lot over the next few years. And in terms of energy consumption, it was 643 terawatt hours, and 24% of this was generated by renewables. So that is significant, but it can also do more, because as we know, and as pointed out, Africa is too rich to be poor. There's a lot of potential for solar, wind, hydro on the continent. So from IRENA's estimate, we did an estimate back in 2015. We look at all the land area in Africa, and we remove the areas which are protected, the areas which cannot be developed, and we look at the resources on those on the area which can be developed. And even then, you would have 8,400 terawatts of PV and 2,000 terawatts of solar CSP on the continent. And right now, what is existing is only 7 terawatts. So that is almost, I don't know, like 0.1% of what is actually available. So imagine if just by increasing the amount of, just by making use of 10% of that potential, that would already be very much higher than what Africa currently has. And compared to the rest of the world, as we know, Africa is still developing, so it is still low relatively, but the rest of the world does give an indication of what Africa can potentially achieve in the future. So as mentioned earlier, Africa has 16% of the world's population. So technically, it should have more energy consumption once the electricity access rates go up. And we do think that renewables will be able to answer to that challenge. So maybe next we will look at what Africa's current targets are, and in terms of future prospects, what we think Africa can achieve. So in terms of the current targets, one thing I want to highlight are the master plans. So in Africa, with the different power pools, each power pool might have a master plan, and the master plan would be drafted after discussions with the different country governments, and it's usually done like quite comprehensively. So for the East Africa Master Plan, for instance, it was published in 2014. For the Southern Africa Power Pool Master Plan, it was done in 2017. And these master plans kind of provide a projection of how the different countries, or how rather the regions, will develop for the next 20 to 30 years. So we have looked into these master plans, and we have identified the gaps, and using these gaps, we redid our analysis. So one thing which I wanted to highlight was demand, as mentioned, is definitely going to grow by a lot in the region. And as seen from this graph on the right, you can see that demand is almost going to triple from 2016 to 2040 levels. And of course, a lot of it in Southern and Eastern Africa will come from Egypt and South Africa. But many of the other countries are also going to see demand increases, more than doubling. So that would be driven by economic growth and driven by increasing energy access. However, if we are to look at the plans, like what did master plans have to offer to meet this demand, it's still mostly coal and gas. So when we look at the master plans for Eastern and Southern Africa, by 2040, they will still expect about 47% of the total power to come from combustible fuels, and that means gas and coal. And that's in their high renewable scenario. And in 2030, this share will be even lower. So the master plans are not very ambitious when it comes to offering an alternative to coal and gas generation. And in terms of the existing capacities that we have right now, according to the current plans and according to the retirement schedules of what is committed. So to be committed means that it's financially already set that these plants are going to come online in the future. It will also not be sufficient. By 2040, half of the capacity that has come online before 2015 will have retired. So that will mean that if no new plants are being implemented, by 2040, there will be a 115 gigawatt gap in Southern and Eastern Africa. So as mentioned, power generation capacity is right now not enough. The option offered right now is coal and gas, and that will have huge implications on carbon emissions. So according to the master plan's base case scenarios, carbon emissions per year are gonna reach 640 or 650 megatons per year by 2030. And by 2040, it's going to triple to what we currently have, that is 400 megatons a year. So that is going to be a lot of CO2 emitted every year. And that is only every year. So if you think about the cumulative CO2 emissions, if you just integrate under this graph, that will be humongous. So what is the alternative? Alternative which IRENA has analyzed and thought would be possible would be a diversified power generation mix driven by renewables energy. So we had done analysis before for all the power pools as mentioned, and we continuously update this. So this is from our last update of all the power pools, and we think that approximately 100 gigawatts of hydro and solar, 100 gigawatts of hydro and wind would be possible, driven by economics, 55 gigawatts of solar, and 38 gigawatts of CSP, and 32 gigawatts of biomass. So if you remember the numbers presented earlier for solar PV, I think it currently stands at 7. So that is like not very high, yeah. And in terms of what the different regions will have, it will be pretty different depending on their resource endowments. These numbers were from our last update, so 2015, so they might have changed right now, but I just want to highlight how much the difference that it has made. So maybe you don't have to care so much about the absolute numbers which are presented here, because we just recently updated our reports, but I just want to show the different proportions of renewable energy that's available on different parts of the continent. So for North Africa, you would have lots of wind, lots of CSP. So in North Africa, CSP would be a good choice, but this cannot be said for all the other parts of the continent. For West Africa, as you know, there's a lot of hydro resource there. For Central Africa, likewise, a lot of hydro, and also some solar. For East Africa, it's mostly hydro and wind, and for Southern Africa, is hydro. Well, it's basically a combination of most of the renewables available. So now I will explain a bit about how we came up with this this analysis. So we did it using SPLAT and SPLAT model. I will explain later. Now I will explain what we did prior to that, which was to select the areas that are good, that are potentially suitable for renewables to be deployed. So we did a zoning analysis back in 2015 with the Lawrence Berkeley Lab in University of Berkeley. We divided zones. We divided areas which are suitable for renewables deployment into smaller zones, and these include both. These include wind, solar, CSP, and we did it for both East and Southern Africa. So in total, we identified 2,500 solar zones and 1,500 wind zones. And out of all of these zones, we then use multi-criteria analysis to select priority zones that we think are even more likely because of the economics to get deployed. So the multi-criteria that we defined were distance to transmission, LCOE, and capacity value. It's also possible to take into account more subjective metrics like the human footprint score, etc. But we didn't. We just tried to make it simple, and we did it for 3 different criteria. And with those 3 different criteria, we selected in total about 335 zones, and then we fed them into the system planning test. So what a SPLAT model is it is an optimization model. We basically feed into it the cost of generation, the transmission costs, the investment costs, or otherwise known as capex. We also feed into it discount rates, etc. Of the different technologies, and then the model does its own optimization and comes up with a plan for the future, a plan that is cost minimal. So that is a very important term, to be cost minimal. It means that it is the cheapest. It is the cheapest combination. It is so if you want to see what should be deployed in 2040, if we are going for the cheapest, what would that be? So that is what the model does. Right now, we use it mostly for the power sector, but we can also use it to cover the entire energy sector, including heat and transport. So in this model, in every hour, your demand must equal to supply. So we can impose constraints like these. We can also impose constraints like policy targets, and out of which we look at what is the best plan. So with these, we have the zone specific, we feed into it the zone specific parameters and profiles. And for each of the zones, it will have its own diurnal pattern. So one important thing in renewable energy is that it's not very predictable. So we can't really predict wind, we can't really predict solar. That means we can't really dispatch it, or rather control it. So unlike a coal plant, if you want to produce more power, you just burn more coal. We can't do that for solar, and there's no way you can make solar PV run at night. So that is maybe one of the disadvantages of renewable energy, that is not dispatchable. But then at the same time, because of their patterns, as you can see on the bottom right figure, they can sometimes offer complementarity. So the figure on the top is solar, the figure on the bottom is wind, and you can see that when solar is producing, maybe at that time wind just happens to be a little bit low, but they complement each other. So that is also one advantage of renewable energy. So from our analysis, what did we find? What do we think the future can possibly look like? Well, certainly it confirms our hypothesis that there's vast opportunities of VRE. So under the reference scenario, which basically means it's cost optimal, we didn't set any target constraints. We already can see 36% of VRE penetration for Southern and Eastern Africa. So that is only considering solar and wind. If we are to consider hydro as well, that would be approximately 60%. So that means that is huge, because it means that, like, with the cheapest options, you can already achieve 60% of renewables by 2040 in Southern and Eastern Africa. If you are to produce less of those renewables, or much less of those renewables, it's going to be more expensive. So why don't you just produce a bit more? Or rather, why don't you just act cost optimally? And we also did scenarios that changes the amount of VRE penetration. So, like, let's say, what happens if the government set higher targets? What happens if the government set lower targets? And the results, they may differ in the details, but we still see lots of renewable deployment around the whole continent. So not just in one area, or not in one or two areas. So the distribution of renewables on the continent is really very dispersed, and that is great news, because it also means that countries can trade their power among them through these power pools, which I will speak about in a bit. Okay, so because of the high renewables deployment, that is possible. What we will see is that firstly, the carbon dioxide emissions are going to reduce. They're going to reduce to a quarter of what the master plans have projected. So with the master plans, as mentioned, it's going to be 1,200 megatons. But if we are to go cost optimally, meaning achieving 36% of renewables and still meeting the demand on the continent, is going to be a quarter. It's only going to be 360 megatons per year. And as also mentioned, it has huge implications for trade, because with different complementary generation profiles, for instance, the DRC and the Rwanda example here, as seen, during the day when the DRC is producing lots of hydro, so this is 2040, when it produces lots of hydro, it can export this amount of hydro to Rwanda, which is its neighbor. And for Rwanda, during the hours where it doesn't have the solar, it can import the hydro from the DRC. So this is pretty important, because it means that not only do we want to look at generation capacity in our agenda, in our goals, we also should look into sharing and pooling of the resources. And that will also create a lot of savings, because it will make sure that you generate where it is most, where it is cheapest, and that has a lot of savings in terms of system cost. And also it can help counter some of the flexibility issues surrounding renewables, because you can always use additional power from elsewhere to meet your needs. So here I have a nice animation of how the generation would look like in terms of daily hourly generation. So the bubbles here, they represent solar and wind plants. But if we are just to focus on South Africa, so this is a solar PV in South Africa that we think would be possible. And as you see here, in the day it generates, and then in the night it doesn't. So when it appears, it's generating. When it disappears, it's basically the night. And in 2030, it gets bigger, and in 2040, it gets even bigger, and there will be more bubbles appearing by 2040. And similarly, with wind, that you see generally the bubbles will increase, because they will increase in numbers, because more wind and more wind gets built, and they get built bigger and bigger. So that is on Southern and Eastern Africa. I also want to talk about setting goals in West Africa and setting the track in West Africa. So as mentioned before, we work with countries on the ground to help them with capacity building, and that's indeed what we did in September 2015 to March 2016. We had a program, a joint training program with the IAEA and the UNFCCC in 10 ECOWAS countries. The focus of that was to maintain their national power sector model and also help them develop some scenarios. And this was in the context of helping them with their ECOWAS National Renewable Energy Plan. So this is a good example of us using the modeling to support different countries to explore renewable targets for their national plans. For this piece of work, we had 3 different scenarios. So for the first scenario, it was based on the master plan. For the second scenario, we incorporated more regional targets. And in the third scenario, we included national renewable energy targets. And these national renewable energy targets were based on the national inputs from the program, which I just spoke about, or from the C4 action agendas. So from the results, what we actually saw was that the national with the national targets will achieve a lot more as compared to the regional targets, which will in turn achieve a bit more than if there were no targets at all. So that was pretty obvious. Then is the numbers here which are interesting. So with the targets, with the national targets, it will be possible to reach 30% 5 years before a track if we only adopted regional targets. So national involvement is very important in West Africa from this analysis. We also saw that we also saw that solar PV and wind are going to increase under the national target scenario. So Nigeria will have the highest amount of solar PV by 2030 because of their high demand, because of the demand makes up a huge proportion of West Africa. But similarly, we also see solar building in a lot of the other countries, and wind will be built in Niger, Senegal, and Ghana. So this is pretty encouraging because it doesn't show that renewables is only possible in one country, but is again possible in many different countries in the region. And roughly 1.5 gigawatts will be built on average for solar PV. 1.5 gigawatts is rather a lot. When we do modeling, we often have to set some realistic upper limits in terms of how much renewables can build a year, and 1.5 is pretty close to the limit that we usually set. Yeah. Not only that, not only do we see more renewables, but renewable targets will also help diversify the regional power generation mix. So to diversify means that we don't depend only on one or two resource types, but we have many different types of resources that we can draw upon. And this will help improve energy security, because imagine if you are a country that is highly dependent on hydropower, but because of climate change, hydro availability might decrease in your country, then you will have to look at other options. And other options, I don't know, other options can't just be built in one or two days. You have to plan ahead. So to look into the future and thinking, hey, I want to diversify and start acting now, would be one key recommendation that we have from looking at these results. So one example would be for Southern and Eastern Africa. In the analysis which I presented earlier, we did do some hydro scenarios saying what would happen if your hydro projects are going to be delayed, or if because of climate change, hydro availability is gonna go down. And we found that because countries can no longer depend on hydro, they will have to depend more on other resources. And what are those other resources that they should turn to? That would be solar as well as wind, and sometimes geothermal. Okay, I will skip this because I've kind of talked about it already. Yeah, again, this is another interesting chart which shows how solar PV has this type of diurnal pattern. So as you can see, during certain hours, solar PV will be producing, and because they are producing, gas don't need to produce so much. And because gas don't need to produce so much, then your carbon emissions will definitely go down. So now I think I'm reaching the point where it's suitable to discuss if we are on track. So as shown in my presentation, Africa is still defining its track, I would say. And this is not just particular to Africa, it's particular to, it's general across all countries in the world that the track is continuously being revised. And what IRENA offers, or what the work that we had Don offered is just to provide a potential plan for how things may go forward. So maybe reviewing globally what are the key milestones over the last years is actually pretty impressive. So since 1997, where we signed the Kyoto Protocol, we have progressed quite a bit. With so on this slide, you see a lot of the different milestones that have been reached over the last 20 years. As of last year, we have seen wind auction and solar PV auction prices drop to about 220 USD per megawatt hour. We saw that in 2018, the global wind capacity reached 590 gigawatts. Of course, right now with the COVID-19, a lot of the things might be put on hold at the moment, but we do think that in the future there will be the pace will pick up and it will continue. So as a recap, the cost of renewable energy had declined rapidly and it will continue to do so. That's what we think. And wind and solar have led the power capacity expansion. So this is worldwide and is derived from statistics of globally, so it's not just particular to Africa alone. And economies are increasingly powered by renewables. So in Europe, we speak about the energy transition, and the energy transition means more electrification, changing traditional cooking to electrified type of heating, changing traditional heating to electrified type of heating, using EVs, using electric vehicles powered by electricity rather than burning oil, so burning petrol, sorry. So this is the type of energy transition that is happening in the other parts of the world. And in Africa, similarly, energy transition is happening because power plants are retiring and governments, countries are looking at what are the new technologies that can replace these current dirty emitters, and at the same time meet its demand. So the energy transition is also happening in Africa, just maybe with a bit more focus on substituting existing retiring generation fleets and expanding energy access of cleaner types of energy. So as we know, by 2030, the global carbon budget is going to run out based on current and planned policies. So at the end of this year, the countries are going to submit their NDCs, and we had made a study on how well the NDCs are in terms of reaching those targets. So I'm going to present three different examples: the Eswatini example, Zimbabwe example, and and Mali example. But I'm going to do it quite quickly because I see that I don't really have so much time. So for Eswatini, in the INDC, which they submitted in 2015. So maybe just to explain what NDCs are, they are nationally determined contributions. They are what countries say that they will contribute to reducing their emissions. So for Eswatini in 2015, and what they submitted, they had thought about doubling the renewable energy share in their final energy mix. They thought about introducing 10% of ethanol in petroleum oil vehicles and phasing out the use of HFC, PFC, SF6 gases. So that's one part of their INDC. And are we on track, or rather, how well defined is the track? So with the Eswatini Energy Master Plan that I spoke about earlier, that we helped with our inputs, there is a scenario which can help reach 48% of their RE share. To reach 48% RE share in the country rather than the committed 32%. So they have definitely done a lot in raising their ambitions. So we see a potential for them to raise their NDC ambitions in the upcoming submissions. And also in terms of the 10% ethanol blend, what we found was that they will have to increase their annual production of molasses from local sugar industry by 84% by 2030. And this will require effective policy measures to ensure investments in the expansion of the sugar industry. So this is maybe one thing that they can think about in the next years, like where is the area of investment for them. So this is for Eswatini. We also looked recently at Zimbabwe. So in Zimbabwe, in 2015, in their submissions, they have thought about reducing its business as usual energy sector per capita emissions by 33%. So this means in 2030, if they had a business as usual energy sector emission, they're going to make it lower to 2.2 tetra CO2 emissions. Sorry, 2.2 tons of CO2 emissions per capita. And this is done by repowering their thermal plants. This is what they think they would do, and completing some hydro plant expansion projects, and also building a new 300 megawatt solar PV plant. And under their scenario, they would also replace the small thermal power plant with additional hydropower plants. So are we on track for this one? Well, despite the hydroelectricity emphasis, there wasn't really a production or capacity target for 2030. So we look into how much they actually committed to, how many committed projects they have, and it turned out that they would need to put in about 4,600 million USD for them to reach this target. So it depends on whether they have already put in this money, and yeah. And also in terms of the 300 megawatt solar capacity by 2030, again, there wasn't any mention of specific utility scale solar electricity production. And in terms of further mitigation actions, they have spoken about ethanol blending and the use of solar water heaters and energy efficiency improvements. However, neither the national determined contributions or their national correspondences provided details on the final power generation or capacity mix in 2030. So we will still say that there is a gap between what they submitted and what is still needed for it to become actual concrete plan. And the third case study which I would like to present is on Mali. Mali we also look at recently. So their target would be to reduce their energy sector emissions by 31.6% compared to a business as usual scenario. What is interesting is that Mali is already a carbon sink nation, which means that they absorb more CO2 than they produce CO2. And they have a bunch of plans, mainly power plants, on upgrading their renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy, on implementing a new power project, on electrification of certain villages with renewable energy system, and this is related to energy access. And what we saw was that they have already received funding for some of these projects, so they're definitely in the pipeline, and it's encouraging to think that, sorry, there's a typo here, that instead of, that despite the fact that they are already a carbon sink, they are still aiming to reduce CO2 emissions further. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I have given you enough context on how the different countries stand in terms of their targets and what is needed for making a good plan, and IRENA's work and contributions in helping in facilitating the making of these plans. And I will mute myself now.
Great. Yanchu, thank you so much for that presentation. It was incredibly informative and well put together, and we really appreciate that. We have about 20 minutes remaining for questions and answers, and for the Q&A session, I'm going to ask Dami to unmute herself and moderate the questions with that. So Dami, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you, Yansu. That was a very fantastic presentation. I mean, it was, thank you so much. I believe that must have taken a lot of effort from you. Thank you once again. So we have a couple of questions from here. I would read them one at a time. So I apologize to everyone if we cannot take all the questions. If time doesn't permit us to take all, we will follow it up via email, but we will take as many as we can. So the first question is that, are there opportunities or examples of cross-border training of power in Africa? And if so, what are their main challenges and benefits to highlight in such cases? Yusu, can you hear me?
Yes, sure. Yeah. Yes, that's a very good question in terms of power transmission. So right now we do see a lot of cross-border transmission lines among countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. In fact, in IRENA, we internally think of it as the Africa Clean Energy Corridor, because there's a corridor going from the east, from Egypt until Southern Africa. So there are a lot of power lines which are cross-border in that region. I would think that we have done a recent update of the power lines which are available. I'm just trying to think of how many there actually are, but definitely around the range of 15, 20 of such permutations of interconnectors among the countries. And one key challenge of power transmission, what we actually saw was that despite there being transmission capacity, it is not always the case that there is power flowing on these lines. So despite the infrastructure being there, perhaps the utilization rate is not the utilization rate can still be increased further. One thing which the continent is currently doing is that it has this PIDA program, which is Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. And one of their key aims for the next phase of the PIDA program is to increase more regional integration among the countries. And this will also mean that there'll be more integration in terms of energy, and that has quite a lot of implications on the transmission lines. IRENA, we also, in our recent analysis, we try to identify certain energy, certain corridors or certain like interconnectors which would be potentially for consideration in this PIDA program, and we did identify quite a few. So one thing I mentioned earlier was DRC and Rwanda. Of course, it's still like a very technical study, and there needs to be more work done when it comes to identifying the actual feasibility. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that answers the person's question. So the second question here that I will go to is about, just a minute. So yeah, for the renewable energy integration scenario presented for sub-Saharan Africa, can the current electricity infrastructure or network, can it support renewable energy integration in the existing grid? Or do you think there will be a need for a complete overhaul, considering the cost?
That is a definitely very good question. So what we look at in our analysis is long-term planning aspects. So we haven't really considered so much of the balancing and ancillary services associated with having very high shares of renewables. And some of my colleagues right now are looking into that, like what happens if you want to have 100% renewable energy, what are the additional needs, and is it even possible? So I would say that more research will have to be done in terms of answering that question. But for now, I definitely think that there will need to be more balancing power if we are indeed to have high levels of renewables. And then in terms of the cost, as mentioned, this cost that we currently look at, the minimum cost is the cost of the whole system. So it's a system cost, and it's not just the cost of generation. It also considers the cost of transmission, of integrating this renewable into the system. Of course, it's not considered perfectly because we didn't take into account any forms of ramping. And of course, in the future, there can be batteries, which we haven't really talked about that much in the current work, but it's one thing which we will look at in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So another question here is still about the current situation of energy in Africa. It says that, wait a minute, it's a long one, so I'm going to take a few minutes. So from the master's plan of the Eastern and Southern African, it's, and from what you have shown, it shows that there's 47% of power will come from coal and gas. And on the other end, by 2040, and on the other end, conventions are set in place for countries. Sorry, I lost that. Okay. How do we reconcile the two concepts of saying that we are trying to reduce the carbon footprint and then the fact that we have existing power coming from coal and gas?
Exactly. So that is one thing which we try to tackle in the long term in our analysis. So according to the current master plans, which we think is inadequate, coal and gas will reach will generate 47% of production by 2040. But this is still inadequate for us because it means tripling the per year carbon emissions to 1,200 megatons per year. So what our analysis tries to do is to come up with an alternative plan that is still able to meet the energy needs, while at the same time having more renewables. So indeed, yes, as you are to build more coal and gas, you will have increases in your carbon emissions, but we want to minimize that as much as possible by building more renewables instead of these coal and gas plants.
Thank you. We still have a few minutes for questions. Okay, so the next one here is that, are there opportunities or examples of cross-border trading of power in Africa? And if so, what are their main challenges and the benefits to highlight in such cases?
So I think I might have already answered that question, but maybe I wasn't super clear. In terms of the current, in terms of the energy, in terms of the opportunities, what we saw was that, so one good example is DRC, the DRC line to South Africa. So as we know, DRC has a lot of hydropower. It doesn't actually have a line that goes to South Africa because they are separated by many countries, but they have recently signed, they have in the last years signed a purchasing power agreement that would allow them to trade the power in case where it is needed. So there's opportunities, as mentioned before, that stems from the fact that different countries have different resources, and different countries' resources complement one another. So that's the main area of opportunity.
Thank
in
you very
terms of, yeah, sorry, please.
Okay, so now there are so many really fantastic questions here, and I'm just trying to take them the best we can take. So the next question here is that how does IRENA engage academia or policymakers in the country they work in? And how do you package your findings to inform policy and academic research?
Sure, yes. So in my team, not only do we work directly with countries, we work with academia. And one thing which we try to do is to collect the best practices of energy planning in academia. So actually very recently in December, my colleagues held a workshop that that had a lot of attendees, speakers, experts from academia who are specializing in geospatial aspect of energy planning. So we got them together and we then discussed the key issues facing energy planning when it comes to geospatial aspects, and we are intending to update a report based on their inputs. So when we do make recommendations, it is always by engaging academia first, because they or rather by engaging academia, we sometimes also directly liaise with different countries. So by doing that, we do have the we have the buy-in from experts which are in the field, and by inviting them to attend our workshops, they do have a sense of accountability towards what we are going to produce in the future, what we are going to say. Maybe I forgot the second part of the question. Do you mind repeating that?
Okay, I probably lost that. Okay, yeah. How do you package the findings to inform research?
Okay, so we publish reports. Reports is one of our main outputs. So if you go to IRENA's website, you will see that we publish many reports, and I think last year we tabulated the reports, and it's like about one a week. So the reports are all publicly available. And another thing is that we often work with things which are open source. So we understand that some software may require additional licenses. However, we try our best to work with things which are open source to all to use. So that is one key advantage and one key selling point of our work, that you can access all the background material and all the background models without having to pay so much for them. We also, as mentioned, hold these expert meetings, and we also present our findings during events, during academic events, during events hosted by the government, etc. So that is how we get our messages out to not just academia but also governments.
Thank you. So at this stage, I think there are about 2-3 questions that are very similar. So I'm going to put them together as one. It's about the role of energy and the awareness of local people and gender, how to integrate the rural areas and the females, especially, into the plan for energy. If this is already going on already, or it's something that you haven't planned at IRENA to do.
Yes, so that is one area which we have looked into. Unfortunately, I'm not the expert on this. However, I can point you to some of the resources and research that we had done. So last year, we looked at female or women's employment within the energy sector. I think the findings will be available on IRENA's website. So if you're interested, you can check that out. We also have a special unit or a special team that deals with these aspects. and I can maybe, if you're interested, I can share some of the resources that we have produced. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not an expert in it, so.
Yeah, so there's a follow-up question to that. Probably it's something you might want to answer. So it's asking that this data we have, the ones that you presented today, are they focusing on the urban cities? Is it urban areas now? Yeah, urban areas and the big cities, or did you put into consideration the local sources and the rural communities as well?
So it depends on the analysis on which country we are analyzing on. So for Southern and Eastern Africa, we took like the demand expansions, the demands increase directly from the master plan. And in the master plan, they did consider increase in energy access rates. So that would have considered partially at least the element of demand increase that is not currently considered in the grid, but we haven't done that in the intricately. We have done that in a very aggregated way. So the demand for our Southern and Eastern Africa power pool analysis is done aggregated, whereas for West Africa, I believe, if I'm not wrong, that we did split up the demand into different sectors. So we analyze industry, urban, commercial, and rural. In there, we also look at distributed generation. So one area of work which we are currently looking at is to incorporate these types of electrification elements into our long-term energy planning model. And we have some options. So there are certain models on the market which are open source. So one example is the onset model is developed by KTH and is adopted by the World Bank to develop their global electrification platform. So we have been looking into it, and it is part of the plan.
Yeah, thank you. So there are there are 2 or 3 questions also that I will match together. They are asking for your personal opinion. And the summary is that, do you think, in your opinion, that renewable energy can overtake the use of energy in Africa, or do you think that we are on track towards achieving energy sustainability in Africa?
That's a very good question. And in terms of personal opinion, so I don't really know if we have official stances on this, but it's pretty obvious that we will have to make sure that renewable energies get deployed and to replace carbon intensive types of generation like gas and coal and oil. As mentioned, this of course has to be done in conjunction with meeting the actual needs of the countries. So not just achieving it for the sake of it, but also achieving it because there is opportunity for power expansions, and because these power expansions are driven by greater needs to access energy, greater needs for economic development. And Africa is at a stage where it can avoid a lot of the missteps that a lot of the other economies and a lot of the other countries have made in the past. It is in a very good position to deploy renewables, especially that it has a lot of renewables available on the continent. Yeah, so I would say that in my personal opinion, definitely Africa would need to make sure that it avoids the same types of missteps and use renewables, which is widely available on its continent for its future power generation.
Thank you, Yingsu. So there's another last interesting question that I think we can use to wrap up the presentation today. So considering that most of our audience today are graduate students who are having research, especially in sustainability fields, what's your advice to them on conducting research on sustainable energy and bridging the gap between the science research and applying it to policy or to the community or the society in terms of energy?
From my personal advice, for me, I got into the field by by attending, like since my university days, I've always been interested in sustainability and energy related issues and development issues. So I would say just you may not need to have to, well, it's certainly very good to always be the best in your field, to do top-notch research, and that is of course very, very important. But then at the same time, like, try to talk to as many people as you can. Try to broaden your horizons by talking to people in the industry, just to have a broader perspective of the evolution of the sector, and maybe not a broader picture that is that complements your strengths, and yeah, that would be my advice. I think maybe Adedoyin would also have some advice. Sorry, I just threw the question at you now.
Thank you very much, Yunshu, for a very elaborate presentation and very detailed as well, and the responses to the questions. Well, coming into the field, it's we have different paths. There are different paths, and let me allude to what Bill Gates said, just very briefly. It was in an interview, and he gave a check to. I mean, somebody asked him, "How did you succeed this far?" And the man said, "How much do you need?" The journalist replied, "I asked, how did you make it?" He repeated the same question and said, "How much do you need?" And then finally, he replied. He said, "How I came this far is because I don't do what you just did now. I don't miss opportunities." So my advice would be, coming to the sector is by maximizing all opportunities available to you. If I say, for instance, I got my first international trip on renewable energy just because I attended the webinar and I responded to questions. There are other opportunities. It could be a workshop. So just look out for opportunities as much as you can. And more importantly, ensure that your work is related to a problem. One of the challenges we have, which I mentioned in the presentation, is that we just do research just to get the A. The best of us get the A out of it, and then we make publications from it. But who else, apart from your supervisor, will be very happy to read about your findings? Is a question you must ask yourself when you're doing your research. So it's very important to ensure that you are attacking a problem. All your efforts in the laboratory, all your effort on the field, all your effort studying should be targeted at a problem. I think those should be two things that I would like to mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that addition Adedoyin, and thank you very much, Yunshu, for your time today and your presentation and asking our questions. I am sorry about the other questions that we may not be able to answer because of time. If you have any other question that you think that you would still want us to answer, kindly send them via email. Send them to mrp@isnad-africa.org, and we will do our best. If we need to forward them to Yunshu or Adedoyin, we will do so, and you will receive answers to them. So I believe we have come to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much for your time today. Do you have any final words for us?
Okay, just to thank you. Appreciate the Clean Energy Solution Center and Vicky that has been behind this, and the MRP team, and also very importantly, Yunshu, who has spent a lot of time to make this presentation. First of all, to prepare the presentation and also to come and make a presentation of the findings of their work, and also to highlight that we'll subsequently be having 2 other webinars. The climate change in Africa, that's looking at the sustainability, impact, and adaptation, including the mitigation strategies. The speaker will be a World Bank expert, Mr. Alan Miller. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for organizing the webinar, and I look forward to also listening in to the future webinars. I find this a very good program. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll get in touch. Thank you.
Great. And Vicky Healy here again. Again, thank you First, I'd like to apologize to all of our attendees that we had this last minute change moving from Zoom over to GoToWebinar. We experienced and found some very fatal, I guess, technical issues with the Zoom program this morning that we weren't able to correct in time. So we found this as an option to successfully deliver the webinar, and we'll continue to deliver these through the GoToWebinar program. So we will send out new registration links to all of you for the subsequent webinars to follow. So with that, I just, again, would, in addition to those apologies, extend a very gracious thank you to our presenters today for some very informative presentations, just chock full of information. We really appreciate the participation of the attendees and hope you found today's webinar valuable and you are taking away good information that is helpful. We will send out a link to a recording of today's webinar with both the audio and the video so that you can go back and listen to and view the webinar at any time and at your convenience. And as Adedoyin mentioned, we will have a second webinar occurring on Thursday. So we hope to see you there again. And with that, I would just like to again say thank you, send you all good wishes. Please stay safe and healthy during this very challenging time that our global community is going through. And with that, this concludes our webinar.